The silence of the Arctic, vast and imposing, was the symphony that cradled Kavik's life. Every whisper of the wind, every crack of the ice, every breath of a creature on the frozen tundra was a familiar note in his existence. The snow, a pure white mantle, covered the land like an ancient secret, and beneath his feet life pulsed at a rhythm he understood with the depth of his own soul. Kavik, in his mid-20s, was a hunter, a guardian of traditions that stretched back generations, and his eyes, a dark, almost black-brown, reflected the silent wisdom of an untouched world. His movements, fluid and economical, were those of a predator in its natural habitat, each step an extension of his will, each gesture a dance with nature. His skin, weathered by the wind and sun reflecting off the snow, told stories of harsh winters and brief summers, and his hands, calloused and strong, were proof of a life of manual labor and constant contact with the land. But the silence was broken, not by the howl of the wind or the cry of a bird of prey, but by a metallic, jarring sound that tore through the air, a sound he had never heard before. The news arrived like an unexpected storm, brought by men in strange uniforms and harsh voices. They spoke of a distant war, a conflict that seemed as unreal as the myths of his ancestors. Kavik did not understand the logic of that world, where men killed other men for lands that could not be hunted, for ideas that could not be touched. He was recruited, his name, Kavik, a whisper in his own tongue, replaced by a strange, hard sound, Elijah Carver. The white men, with their twisted tongues and deaf ears, could not pronounce his true name, and so a piece of his identity was torn away, replaced by an alien convenience. The journey was a sensory torture. The smell of smoke and oil, the incessant noise of machines and voices, the crowding of bodies in confined spaces, everything was an assault on his senses, accustomed to the vastness and purity of the Arctic. He felt the weight of others' gazes, curiosity mixed with disdain, the incomprehension of a world he also did not understand. The city, a monster of stone and iron, rose before him, a labyrinth of streets and buildings that seemed to suffocate the very air. The air, heavy and polluted, scratched his throat, and the smell of sweat and fear seemed to permeate every corner. His instincts, sharpened by survival in nature, screamed for escape, for a return to the silence and clarity of the ice. But he was trapped. A fish out of water, a hunter in an iron cage, with a name that was not his and a destiny he had not chosen. The pain of homesickness was a heavy burden, but also a flame that burned in his chest, a constant reminder of what he had left behind and what he might never see again. The training camp was a microcosm of the chaos Kavik now inhabited. The air, once pure and biting in the Arctic, was now saturated with the acrid smell of gunpowder, sweat, and a palpable anxiety. Shouts of command echoed from all directions, mingling with the constant crackle of gunfire and the roar of engines. It was a deafening cacophony to ears accustomed to the whisper of snow and the song of the wind. Kavik felt like a caged animal. His hunter's instincts, so sharp in his natural environment, now seemed useless, overwhelmed by the avalanche of stimuli. He observed the other soldiers, their faces tense, their movements abrupt, and the incomprehension in their eyes mirrored his own. It was in this whirlwind that he found his squadmates. 3 men, all francophone, whose voices, though in a language he barely grasped, carried nuances that he, with his keen sensitivity, began to decipher. Jean-Luc Dubois, the sergeant, was a rock. His blue eyes, though tired, held the flame of a born leader, always attentive and assessing. He observed Kavik with a mixture of curiosity and respect, a silent acceptance that was more valuable than 1,000 words. Jean-Luc, with his deep voice, gave concise orders, and Kavik, even without understanding the words, grasped the intention behind them, the urgency, the need for precision. He saw the worry in the lines on Jean-Luc's forehead, the responsibility weighing on his broad shoulders. Antoine Leclerc, the youngest, was a vibrant contrast. His green eyes, large and expressive, reflected a childlike curiosity and a stubborn hope that the war had not yet managed to extinguish. He tried to communicate with Kavik with gestures in simple French, a fragile bridge across the cultural abyss. Antoine saw in Kavik not a savage, but a human being with a different wisdom, and his innocence was a balm amidst the brutality. Kavik felt the purity in his soul, the eagerness for connection, and responded with a nod, a contained smile, small gestures that for Antoine were a universe of meaning. Pierre Gagnon, the most reserved, was a silent but attentive shadow. His deep, penetrating brown eyes seemed to analyze everything around him, rarely revealing his emotions. He observed Kavik with a quiet curiosity, recognizing the effectiveness of his scouting skills and the way he moved in the environment. He trusted his instincts and his ability to read people in situations. He was a protector, especially of Antoine, and his calm, vigilant presence was a pillar of strength for the group. Kavik felt the trust Pierre placed in him, a non-verbal trust, based on observation and mutual respect. The language barrier was an obstacle, but the language of the body, of glances, of small actions, spoke louder. They were an unlikely group, united by necessity and the imminence of danger, each bringing their own strengths and weaknesses to the iron cage that was the training camp, preparing for an uncertain fate in distant lands. The European night was different from the Arctic night. Their darkness was a canvas for the northern lights, a translucent veil that revealed the stars in their fullness. Here, in the dense forest, darkness was a heavy, damp, oppressive cloak that swallowed light and amplified sounds. The smell of wet earth, decaying leaves, and a strange sweetness of pine filled the air, an unfamiliar aroma to Kavik, accustomed to the clean, sharp scent of ice and snow. The nocturnal mission to capture the German outpost began under a creeping fog that embraced the trees like silent ghosts, making every step a gamble into the unknown. Kavik, now Elijah to his comrades, felt the dampness penetrate his clothes, a cold different from the Arctic, one that didn't freeze but seeped into his bones. His senses, sharpened by life and nature, were on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind through the trees was interpreted, analyzed. He moved with an almost supernatural lightness, his feet meeting the ground with the softness of a feather, avoiding dry branches and leaves that could betray their presence. His companions, Jean-Luc, Antoine, and Pierre, followed him closely, trusting his instincts, even if they didn't fully comprehend the depth of his connection to that strange environment. The silence of the forest was broken only by the muffled sounds of their own footsteps and the accelerated beating of their hearts. Elijah felt the tension in the air, an electricity that preceded the storm. He remembered the caribou hunts, the patience needed to approach the prey, the reading of the subtlest signs. But here, the prey was different. It wasn't an animal guided by instinct, but men, with their machines and their unpredictable tactics. The predator, as he had thought, was made of iron, but also of flesh and blood, and the hunt was a deadly dance where roles could reverse at any moment. Antoine, breathing heavily, stumbled over an exposed root, and the sound, though muffled, seemed to echo throughout the forest. Elijah turned, his eyes meeting Antoine's, who apologized with a glance. Jean-Luc, with a nod, indicated they should continue. Pierre, ever vigilant, covered the rear, his eyes scanning the darkness. Elijah felt the vulnerability of his companions, their reliance on his skills, and a sense of responsibility weighed on him. He was the guide, the scout, the link between the wild world and civilized warfare. And as they advanced, the fog thickened, and the forest seemed to whisper ancient secrets, setting the stage for the imminent confrontation. The smell arrived before the sight. A metallic, pungent odor of dried blood mixed with the stale scent of cigarette smoke and a sweet, nauseating stench of decaying flesh. It was the smell of death, an aroma Kavik knew well from hunts, but here, in the European forest, it carried a different, more sinister connotation. The fog, which had once been an ally, now seemed an accomplice, concealing the atrocity that revealed itself as they approached the German outpost. The sight that unfolded before them was a punch to the gut, a macabre tableau that violently contrasted with the natural beauty of the forest. A small, makeshift camp with camouflaged tents and poorly extinguished fires revealed the enemy's presence. But it wasn't the presence itself that shocked, but what accompanied it. Bodies, not of enemy soldiers, but of civilians, lay scattered on the ground, some tied to trees, others thrown into shallow ditches. The silence that enveloped them was more terrifying than any scream, a heavy silence of despair and cruelty. The faces of the dead, distorted by terror, told stories of unspeakable suffering. Kavik felt a shiver run down his spine, a cold that didn't come from the environment, but from human wickedness. The iron predator, as he had thought, was not just a war machine, but a soulless entity capable of a brutality that surpassed that of any wild animal. Jean-Luc, his face contorted in a mask of contained fury, tightened his grip on his rifle. Antoine, pale and wide-eyed, seemed on the verge of vomiting, his innocence shattered by the scene. Pierre, though maintaining his usual composure, had his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the bodies, a silent rage burning in his gaze. The Germans' presence was almost palpable, an oppressive weight in the air. They were the hunters, but there, at that moment, they felt like prey, cornered by the darkness and the depravity emanating from the camp. Suddenly, a harsh, guttural voice cut through the silence, followed by brutal laughter. It was the voice of Klaus Richter, the Oberleutnant, and his words, though intelligible to Kavik, carried a tone of contempt and superiority that he understood perfectly. Richter's imposing figure emerged from the fog, his impeccable uniform contrasting with the dirt and desolation around him. Beside him, Hans Schmidt, the young soldier, looked like a pale shadow, his empty eyes avoiding the gaze of the bodies. Richter's arrogance was almost a scent, an odor of power and cruelty that mingled with the smell of death. Kavik felt a cold hatred grow in his chest, a hatred different from that he felt for an animal that needed to be hunted to survive. This was a hatred for something that disrespected life itself, that desecrated the land and humanity. The hunt had changed. It was no longer about survival, but about justice. And he, Kavik, the Arctic hunter, was ready to become the predator. The air was heavy with the promise of violence, but Kavik, now Elijah, found a strange familiarity in the impending danger. The forest, once an oppressive labyrinth, began to reveal its secrets to him, as if the trees whispered ancient hunting songs. His eyes, accustomed to discerning the smallest track in the snow, now distinguished the safest paths through the dense foliage, the deepest shadows for concealment. The German outpost, with its sentries and flickering fires, was prey, and he, the hunter, was ready to infiltrate. He led the way, his movements silent and precise, Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. Jean-Luc, Antoine, and Pierre followed him, a line of almost invisible shadows in the darkness. Communication between them was through subtle gestures, quick glances, a non-verbal language that became increasingly fluid. Elijah pointed to a fallen branch, and Pierre carefully moved it aside. He indicated a sentry with a nod, and Jean-Luc adjusted his aim. Antoine, though still visibly shaken by the scene of the civilians, followed with renewed determination, his eyes fixed on Elijah's silhouette. The smell of cigarette smoke and the muffled sound of German voices grew more distinct. Elijah crawled to an observation point, his eyes scanning the perimeter. There were 2 sentries, one near the fire, the other patrolling the edge of the clearing. He signaled to Jean-Luc, indicating each one's position. The plan was simple: neutralize the sentries and enter the outpost. But simplicity in war was an illusion, and the slightest mistake could be fatal. A sound of breaking a twig. Elijah froze, his muscles tense, his heart pounding in his chest. The sentry near the fire turned his head, his eyes scrutinizing the darkness. The air grew thick, each second an eternity. Elijah felt cold sweat trickle down his forehead. He remembered the times a caribou had scented him, the tension before the escape. But here, escape was not an option. The sentry, after a few moments of hesitation, turned back to the fire, the sound of the twig attributed to the wind or an animal. Elijah let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jean-Luc, with a look of relief, nodded. Pierre, with an almost imperceptible smile, pointed to the patrolling sentry. Elijah moved again, a ghost in the night. He approached the patrolling sentry, his footsteps muffled by the foliage. With a quick and precise movement, he neutralized him, a muffled sound, a body falling softly to the ground. Jean-Luc took care of the other sentry. Silence returned, but now it was a different silence, a silence of victory, but also of growing tension. They were inside. Elijah's heart beat to the rhythm of a war drum, but his hunter's instincts, once overwhelmed, now guided every fiber of his being. The hunt had truly begun. The German outpost, once a flickering light in the forest's darkness, was now a viper's nest, and Elijah felt the danger in every fiber of his being. They moved like shadows, each in their position, ready for the attack. Jean-Luc, with his experience, coordinated their movements with minimal gestures. Antoine, despite his fear, stood firm, his rifle ready. Pierre, ever vigilant, covered the rear, his eyes scanning the darkness for any suspicious movement. Elijah, with his keen senses, detected the smell of tobacco and cheap cologne even before he saw the imposing figure of Klaus Richter. The Oberleutnant, accompanied by Hans Schmidt and other soldiers, emerged from one of the tents, their harsh voices cutting through the air. They were about to attack, but fate, or luck, seemed to have other plans. A dry branch, broken under the weight of one of the German soldiers, echoed in the stillness of the night. The sound, though subtle, was enough to alert Richter. "Halt!" Richter's shout ripped through the air, and the forest, once silent, exploded into chaos. Shots cut through the darkness, and the smell of burnt gunpowder mingled with the forest's aroma. Elijah and his companions threw themselves to the ground, seeking cover. The battle had begun, not as a planned attack, but as an inverted ambush where they, the hunters, became the hunted. Jean-Luc shouted orders in French, his voice hoarse with tension. Antoine, wide-eyed, fired his rifle, the sound deafening in his ears. Pierre, with deadly precision, aimed and brought down approaching enemies. Elijah, with his hunter's instincts sharpened, moved quickly, using the forest as his ally, dodging bullets and seeking strategic positions. He saw the German soldiers, their faces distorted by hatred and fear, and felt fury grow in his chest. It was no longer a hunt, but a fight for survival, for Antoine's memory, and for all those who had fallen into the hands of that despicable enemy. Antoine's death ignited a cold fury in Elijah, a flame that burned behind his once serene eyes. The pain of loss, mixed with rage at the enemy's brutality, transformed him. He was no longer just a scout, a guide. He was a spirit of vengeance, a primordial predator unleashed amidst the chaos of war. The sound of gunshots and explosions became a rhythm, the smoke and the smell of blood a familiar haze. His movements, once calculated and silent, were now driven by an implacable ferocity. Jean-Luc, his face smudged with soot and tears, fought alongside Elijah, a combat machine fueled by pain and the need to protect what remained of his team. Pierre, wounded in the arm, continued to fire with one hand, his eyes fixed on the enemies, his determination unwavering. The German soldiers, led by Richter, advanced with brutal confidence, underestimating the Canadians' resilience. Richter, with a cruel smile, shouted orders, his voice a whip in the air, while Schmidt, pale and trembling, followed him like a shadow, firing aimlessly. Elijah, ignoring the pain of a superficial leg wound, used the forest to his advantage. He moved among the trees, a fleeting shadow, flanking the enemies. His hunter's instincts, honed by years of survival in the Arctic, allowed him to anticipate the enemy's movements, to predict their steps. He brought them down one by one, with the precision of a hunter felling his prey. Each blow, each shot, was a silent tribute to Antoine, a revenge for his stolen life. Richter, realizing Elijah's deadly effectiveness, focused his men on him. The final confrontation was inevitable. Elijah, gasping for breath and his body exhausted, saw Richter approach, his icy eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. Schmidt, hidden behind Richter, fired a shot that hit Elijah in the chest. A sharp pain, a warmth spreading rapidly. Elijah staggered, but did not fall. Fury propelled him. He saw the fear in Schmidt's eyes, the cowardice that made him as despicable as his leader. With a final effort, Elijah lunged at Richter, a wounded beast in his last attack. The fight was brutal, a clash of wills and ideologies. Richter, with his brute strength and military training, tried to subdue Elijah, but the Inuit, with his agility and tenacity, resisted. He tasted his own blood, the smell of earth and gunpowder. With a guttural cry, Elijah managed to immobilize Richter, his eyes fixed on the Germans, a mixture of hatred and triumph. But strength was leaving him. He felt life draining away, the cold of the Arctic returning, not as a threat, but as a familiar embrace. His eyes closed, and silence, true silence, finally enveloped him. The last hunt was over, and the hunter, exhausted, had found his eternal rest. The morning sun, pale and hesitant, tried to break through the veil of fog that still hung over the forest, revealing the devastation of the night. The battlefield, once a stage of fury and despair, now lay in a heavy silence, punctuated only by the groans of the wounded and the rustling of leaves under the feet of the survivors. Jean-Luc and Pierre, exhausted and scarred by the fight, searched the bodies, looking for their comrades, for a sign of life, for a glimmer of hope. It was Pierre who found him, the body of Elijah, or Kavik, as he now called him in his thoughts, lying amidst the foliage, his face serene, as if he had finally found the peace that war had denied him. Jean-Luc knelt beside him, the pain of loss tightening his chest. He had seen many men die, but Elijah's death, so silent and determined, seemed to carry a different weight. Beside him, on the damp ground, was a small leather pouch, and inside it, a crumpled piece of paper. It was Elijah's letter, written in broken French, but with a firm handwriting, a testament to his soul. Jean-Luc unfolded the paper with trembling hands and began to read, his voice choked with emotion. To those who find these words, know that the ice and snow are my brothers, and the wind my guide. I am Kavik, and my true name is a whisper that the white men cannot pronounce. They called me Elijah, a name that was never mine, but which I carried out of duty. I came from a world where silence is wisdom, and the hunt a dance of respect. Here, silence is broken by screams, and the hunt is a senseless slaughter. The predator here is made of iron, but its heart is colder than the harshest Arctic winter. I saw the city, a monster of stone and smoke, and smelled death in its streets. I saw men become beasts, and innocence crushed. I fought not for flags or distant lands, but for the faces I saw, for the smiles that faded, for the hope that still burned in some hearts. I fought for Antoine, the young man who saw beauty where others saw only darkness. I fought for Jean-Luc, the leader who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. I fought for Pierre, the silent one, who understood without words. My letter is a diary of pain, yes, but also of a truth I found in the darkness. The forest here is different from mine, but fear and courage are the same everywhere. I fell, but not in vain. May my death be a reminder that humanity, even in its brutality, can still find light. May my sacrifice not be forgotten, but inspire those who still breathe to fight for a world where silence is peace and the hunt only for survival. I return to the ice, to the snow, to the wind. My spirit flies free, back home. Jean-Luc finished reading, tears streaming down his face. Pierre beside him had watery eyes. Elijah's letter was not just a farewell, it was a legacy, a testament to the strength of the human spirit amidst adversity. They buried Elijah right there, under the trees of the European forest, a piece of the Arctic forever in foreign soil. And as they did, the sun finally broke through the fog, bathing the forest in a golden light, as if heaven itself was paying homage to the forgotten hero, to the hunter who found his purpose in war and his peace in death.